For 11 years, Carol Burnett ran one of the warmest sets in television history. Former cast members, writers, and guest stars have said again and again in interviews that her studio felt less like a competitive Hollywood workplace and more like a family. She hugged her audience before every taping. She answered their questions live, unscripted, week after week. She built a reputation as one of the kindest, most generous stars in the business. But even Carol Burnett, by her own account, had a limit. And in her 2016 memoir, she finally wrote about the one guest star who pushed past it, without ever naming him. Before we get to that story, it helps to understand just how unusual Carol Burnett's relationship with her guest stars really was. The Carol Burnett Show ran on CBS from 1967 to 1978, and across those 11 seasons it pulled in some of the biggest names in entertainment. Lucille Ball, Jimmy Stewart, Cher, Sammy Davis Jr., Steve Lawrence, Rita Hayworth, Betty White. Burnett has said in multiple interviews that she considered many of these guests close friends, not just co-workers passing through for a week of rehearsals. She wrote entire chapters of her memoir praising the writers, the crew, and the performers who made the show what it was. That's part of why the one exception stood out so sharply, both to her and to the people who worked alongside her. In her memoir, In Such Good Company, 11 Years of Laughter, Mayhem, and Fun in the Sandbox, published in 2016, Burnett dedicated a passage to what she called, in her own words, the only guest in 11 years who was a genuine problem. She wrote that he wasn't a happy camper from the moment he arrived, and that the cast and crew tried to accommodate him at every turn without any success. That single sentence, buried in a book otherwise full of affectionate memories, hinted at a very different kind of week on set. According to Burnett's account, the tension didn't build slowly. It was there from the start of rehearsals. Most guest stars on the show, by every available account from Burnett and her regular cast, arrived nervous but excited, aware that Carol Burnett's set had a reputation for being unusually welcoming. This particular guest, she wrote, seemed to resist that atmosphere from day one. The crew tried different approaches to ease him into the rhythm of the show, the same way they had with hundreds of guests before him. Nothing worked. Burnett described his mood as constant and unmovable, regardless of what the production offered him. Then came the moment that made this guest genuinely unique in the show's 11-year run. The day before the episode was scheduled to tape, he simply left. Burnett wrote that his walking out wasn't shocking to anyone by that point, given how the week had gone, but it still forced the production to scramble. A show built on a tight weekly schedule, with a live studio audience already anticipating a taping, doesn't have much room to absorb a lead guest vanishing less than 24 hours before cameras roll. According to Burnett, the cast and crew adjusted quickly, the way they'd learned to adjust to almost anything in over a decade on the air, but the disruption stuck with her long enough that she still remembered it clearly when she sat down to write her memoir decades later. It was only afterward, Burnett wrote, that she and the crew pieced together a possible explanation. She said they later learned the guest had been on something during his time on set, which in her telling helped explain, though not excuse, the erratic behavior they'd witnessed all week. She didn't offer more specifics than that in the book, and she has never named him publicly in any interview since the memoir's release. What she did share was the nickname one of her own writers gave him behind the scenes, a phrase that has since been repeated across entertainment outlets whenever the story resurfaces, calling him a belligerent little SOB. Burnett even explained the word little in that description had a literal meaning. She noted he was quite short, which had prompted one writer to give him an even more pointed nickname referencing his height. What makes this passage so memorable to longtime fans of a show isn't just the insult itself. It's the contrast. This is a woman who wrote warmly about nearly everyone who ever stepped onto her set, cast members she hired straight out of open auditions, guest stars she'd admired since childhood, crew members who worked with her for over a decade. Her memoir is, by design, a love letter to the show and the people who built it with her. Reviewers who covered the book on its release noted this exact quality. It reads less like a tell-all and more like a thank you note, generous almost to a fault. Which means the one guest she singled out for criticism and still refused to name even years later stands out precisely because it was so unlike her. Burnett's decision to withhold the name has fueled speculation among fans and entertainment writers ever since the book came out in 2016. Various outlets have tried to connect the description to specific guest stars from a show's run based on height, era, and reported behavior, but Burnett herself has never confirmed any of those guesses, and no other primary source, no crew memoir, no contemporaneous news account, has independently named him either. That silence appears to be intentional. Throughout her career, Burnett has been notably careful about protecting the privacy of people who behaved badly around her, even when she's been openly critical of the behavior itself. She's spoken about this instinct in other contexts too, including her approach to sensitive family matters in her later memoirs. It's a consistent thread in how she's told her own story. She'll describe what happened to her plainly, but she's reluctant to use her platform to publicly humiliate someone by name, even someone who, by her own account, made an 11-year run of otherwise good experiences noticeably worse for a week. This restraint is worth sitting with for a moment, because it says something about how Burnett has handled conflict throughout her long career. The clearest documented example of her actually confronting a collaborator head-on didn't involve a guest star at all. It involved one of her own regular cast members, Harvey Korman, and it's a story Burnett has told in far more detail, both in her memoir and in television interviews, because unlike the anonymous guest, it had a resolution she was proud of. By her own account, and confirmed separately by Korman himself in later interviews, tensions built gradually during one particular week of production. Burnett has said that Korman arrived for a rehearsal in a foul mood, and rather than keeping it to himself, he was short with the guests scheduled to appear that week. She named them in her memoir as Tim Conway, who had not yet joined the cast as a full-time regular, and Petula Clark, both of whom she described as easy to work with. Burnett wrote that Korman was scowling throughout rehearsal and was rude to both of them at different points in the day. Concerned, Burnett went to Korman's dressing room privately to ask what was wrong. According to her account, Korman didn't want to discuss it and effectively told her to stay out of it. For a leading lady who had spent years building a set defined by mutual respect and camaraderie, that dismissal crossed a line for her. She has said in a televised interview for Pioneers of Television that Korman reminded her he had a contract, and that she told him plainly she could end that contract if he continued being difficult with guests. Rather than escalate further in the moment, Burnett made a decision that stunned the production. She called Korman's agent directly after the confrontation and told him Korman was finished on the show, effective after that evening's taping. What happened next is the part of the story Burnett tells with the most warmth, because it shows how the conflict actually resolved. According to her memoir, she reconsidered over the following days, understanding that Korman was dealing with real personal strain in his life at the time. His marriage was under significant pressure, and she didn't want to end a partnership that had defined so much of the show's identity. She has written that she told him he could come back under one condition: leave whatever mood he arrived in at the door, and if he did, it would, in her words, tickle me pink to see him skipping down the hallway whistling instead. According to interviews Korman gave later in his career, including for the retrospective Carol Burnett, a woman of character, he did exactly that, arriving the following Monday in an exaggerated display of cheerfulness that broke the tension for the entire crew. Korman has said he'd never seen that side of Burnett before, and that it genuinely startled him. In his words, she scared the crap out of him that day. But by his own account, the moment didn't damage their partnership. If anything, it deepened his respect for her, because it proved she was willing to protect the atmosphere of her own show even against one of its biggest stars. That distinction between the two stories is worth pointing out clearly, because it's easy to blur them into one narrative of difficult men Carol Burnett had to deal with. They're not the same kind of story at all. The Korman conflict was, in the end, a story about repair. Two collaborators who clashed hard worked through it, and by every account available, respected each other more afterward. When Korman died in 2008 at the age of 81, Burnett spoke about him with visible affection, describing their partnership as one of the defining creative relationships of her career. The unnamed guest star story has no such resolution on record. There was no reconciliation, no return engagement, no warm anecdote told years later at an award ceremony. Just a week that went badly, an early departure, and a line in a memoir written decades afterward that stops short of forgiveness, or even a name. It's also worth noting what Burnett's memoir doesn't claim, because there's been some blurring of this online over the years. She never wrote that the guest was violent, and she never accused him of anything beyond being persistently difficult to work with and ultimately unreliable enough to walk off the production early. The word she used most often to describe the week was simply pain, not danger, not cruelty aimed at her personally. It reads, in context, less like a story about being wronged and more like a story about professionalism, about what happens on a set built around collaboration when one person, for whatever reason, isn't able or willing to meet everyone else halfway. What struck many longtime fans of the show, revisiting this story after the memoir's release, is how rare this kind of account is from Burnett at all. Across decades of interviews, 2 full memoirs about her career, and countless retrospectives, she has talked at length about hard chapters in her personal life, her parents' struggles with alcoholism, her own divorce, the loss of her daughter Carrie Hamilton to cancer in 2002. She has never been a performer who avoided difficult subjects. But when it comes to people she worked with professionally, her instinct has consistently been to protect rather than expose, even when she's been willing to admit that a specific week or a specific person genuinely tested her patience. That instinct is arguably part of why The Carol Burnett Show is remembered the way it is, not just as a hit series, but as a genuinely happy set, one that dozens of former cast, crew, and guest stars have described the same way across nearly 6 decades of interviews. The existence of one bad week, deliberately left anonymous, doesn't really undercut that reputation. If anything, it reinforces it. Burnett had the material and the platform to name names if she wanted to. She chose, instead, to tell just enough of the story to be honest about it, and no more. So the guest star Carol Burnett never wanted to work with again remains unnamed, likely by design, and probably will stay that way. What we do know from her own words is that it happened exactly once in 11 years on a show built almost entirely on goodwill, and that even her harshest documented account of a professional conflict ends not with resentment, but with restraint. What do you think? Do you have a guess who this guest star might have been? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more classic Hollywood stories.